Good afternoon. It's Katarina speaking. Just to check before I continue, if you can hear me, it would be great to get a quick message in the chat to make sure that my sound and video are working. Okay, perfect. This should work now. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you on this webinar on behalf of the Childhub. For those of you who joined our previous sessions on this topic, you know this is the third and the last session in the mini webinar series that we organized on conducting forensic interviews at the Barnahus. We discussed first the importance of having the forensic interview in general with children, and then we discussed last week how we can adapt it to the needs of the child. Today we are closing with a very interesting discussion on preventing re-victimization. And before I give floor to Shona, who is the Promise project manager, I just want to share a few quick things with you. First of all, starting with technical details. For those of you who are new, a quick note that Childhub webinars are being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the webinar page after the session ends, so you can share it with colleagues who couldn't join us live today. Also, the presentation that you see today will be there, so if you just go to our webinar page after the webinar, you will be able to find it. If you, on the top black bar, you should see a green icon, and you should make sure this icon remains green throughout the webinar so that you can hear us and the speaker. Unfortunately, for participants, it is not possible to use microphone, so we kindly ask you to use chat. And we are really welcoming and inviting you to use it to tell us about where you come from, what you do, and also to share your experience, comments, and any questions. It is a unique opportunity that we have interesting presenter like today, and it's a very good opportunity for you to ask any questions you may have on this topic. Before of course, my colleague Vesna and I are here to help you with any technical problems if you have during the webinar. So just please write us in the chat if you cannot hear or you have any other technical problems, and we will do our best to help you. Before I continue, I just want to raise your awareness about one interesting opportunity that we currently have. It's also possible to find it on a Childhub, but if you scroll up on your chat, you will see a link I shared earlier today in this chat, which is on your bottom right corner. If you just go up, there is a link, and basically if you click on it, you will be able to read about an initiative that we have with a Swedish company. And one of the things we are exploring is how we can use technology to help professionals conducting interviews with children practice beforehand, so that by the time you actually get to interact with a child, you are ready and you can avoid some mistakes that would, for example, contribute to further traumatizing the children, or you can just know how to what strategies and techniques you can employ in given situation to get the best possible outcome. This is a demo test that we will have next Monday, March 18th, and we are inviting you to register and to join us. We have a limited number of places, but if you are fast, you may get your place still. And so it's an interesting opportunity for you to meet a virtual child called Carl and to try your interviewing skills and to learn from professionals what are the good things you can try, and actually to try to practice it. We hope you find this useful and you join us. And without any further ado, I give floor to Shona, Promise Project Manager. Shona, the floor is yours, and here are also your slides. Thank you once again all for joining, and it's a pleasure to have you all here today.
Thank you so much, Katarina, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shauna von Blixen from the Council of the Baltic Sea States, and we are the lead partner on Promise, which is promoting the Barnahus model spreading throughout Europe. And before I welcome today's speaker, I will very shortly say what Barnahus is and why we are here. and set the stage for today's webinar. So the Barnahus is sometimes known as a children's house, and it's not a place where children go to stay. Rather, it is a child-friendly office where law enforcement, criminal justice, child protection services, medical, and mental health workers all come together to cooperate under one roof, a child-friendly location, and they're cooperating to listen to the child's story and provide rapid access to justice and care for child victims and witnesses of violence. We're now in the second phase of Promise. In the first phase, we launched a European-level dialogue, which explored the criteria for Barnahus and developed standard-setting publications. During this process, select professionals from around Europe were invited, and our speaker today was actually an especially influential expert in this process. Now in our second phase, Promise is supporting countries to develop their own national dialogue, agreements, capacity, and more. And with this webinar series, it's an open invitation for everyone to join these discussions and take part in the learnings within the European Barnahus movement. These learnings include key principles, standards, and challenges that you should consider when you're opening and operating a multidisciplinary interagency collaboration for child victims and witnesses of violence. We're so glad that you all could join us today. And if you have any questions about the Barnahus model more generally, please don't hesitate to ask in the chat. We know that many of our listeners, sometimes this is the first time that they're hearing about it, so we're happy to inform you. And we have many knowledgeable colleagues on the call today who can share their knowledge and experience. But of course, we especially encourage questions about the topic of today's webinar, which is the forensic interview. Now, a key common criteria of a Barnahus is that it ensures the evidentiary validity of the child statement in line with the principle of due process and is preventing the child from having to repeat the statement during court proceedings. The forensic interview is a critical piece of the puzzle in meeting this criteria. And before handing over to Olof, I want to highlight the Promise Barnahus Quality Standards. It's a publication that we put out in the first phase, and it has standard number 6 about the forensic interview. So you can go there to read much more about this one. But I will highlight in particular that forensic interviews, according to our standards, are carried out by specialized staff members in a child-friendly environment. The interview is adapted to each child and follows evidence-based practices and protocols. A multidisciplinary and interagency team is on site. They're watching the interview from another room, and this interview is recorded to be used as evidence. And the defendant's right to a fair trial and equity of arms are protected. You should know that research has shown that repeated interviews can be very traumatic for the child and can cause re-traumatization. This can be even more harmful for the child than the abuse itself. So special measures need to be taken to provide children with opportunities to give evidence as few times as possible in an emotionally and physically safe environment, while still securing a successful criminal investigation and judicial process. You can read about this and much more in the Barnahus Quality Standards. We have a summary in a number of languages. We have an ebook, we've got a long version, and some other publications that you should also take a look at the link on the screen. It is now time to welcome our speaker for the day, Ms. Olof Alsta Farstvit. You are the leader of Barnahus Iceland and one of our most in-demand experts in the Promise Network. And I know you have been traveling all over Europe these days to speak and to train. And we are so honored that you could take some time today to deliver this webinar. And I welcome you to take it away.
Thank you, Shona. Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here with you today, and I'm going to give you a short information about the forensic interviewing technique we are doing here in Iceland. So if you have any questions later on, please do not hesitate to put it in the chat. I would be happy to answer them maybe afterwards, after my presentation. Barnahus in Iceland was opened 1st of November 1998. So it's quite a long time since we have been operating. But our Barnahus is in a child-friendly environment, which we think is very important when children are coming and disclosing about sexual abuse or physical abuse. It's very important to have a location where children can be relaxed. We have, even though it's an institution paid by the government, it doesn't look like an institution. It is in a residential area. And when children are coming to Barnahus, we welcome them with a juice. We talk to the child first and show them that this house is made for children and first and foremost. We have age-appropriate waiting rooms, which is very important for young children to feel welcomed and also the teenagers. So the first poll question I would like you maybe to answer is, have you ever heard about Barnahus before? Okay, thank you. I think we should continue then. The interviewing rooms are specially designed for children, even though we don't have a lot of distractions, because that's very important, because we need this eye contact with the child while we are interviewing them. They should feel neutral and safe in the interviewing room. And we have camera, which we tell them about in the beginning, and on the picture you can see one of those interviewing rooms we have, and then we have other monitoring room where the people who are watching the interview can follow the interview through TV screen. The interviewer has an earplug in the ear so they can be in direct contact with the other person, usually the judge, who is in charge of the forensic interview. Everyone can, though, ask questions through the questionnaire. The forensic interviewing, we use only evidence-based protocols. NICHD and NCAC protocols are very common and known both in Europe and USA, and this is the protocols we are using. Those protocols have been using since over 30 years, and they are evidence-based, which is very important. These forensic interviewing protocols are non-judgmental, truth-seeking, and it's important as an interviewer that you are neutral in tone, that you don't show any facial expressions while you are interviewing children. And this protocol is accurate, credible, and complete information you get while using these methods, which I will go deeper into later. And the interview is recorded on DVD disc, which is the child's disclosure, and that is the child's witness in court later on in the process. So, second poll questions. Are you familiar with these interviewing protocols I was mentioning, NICHD and NCAC protocols? Okay, thank you. And we will continue. When you're interviewing children, it's very important that you think about everything in the child's surroundings. We need to think about the timing, the time frame. Is the child tired? Thank you. What time is the child taking any medication? And if they are taking any, it's very important, for example, children with ADHD, if they are taking any medication, that we will interview the child while they are in having already taken their medication. Has the child eaten? Are we taking interview at 11 o'clock when the child is getting hungry? Is the child missing any fun activities, because that can influence the interview? And does the child need to go to the restroom? All those things we need to check out before we start the interview. The goals of the interview is to maximize information from the child, and using open-ended questions, which I will go deeper into later, is important because we need as much information from the child in this interview, because this is the only interview we are maybe using in a court proceeding. This interview is also, the goal is to minimize the impact of the interview on the child, because we don't want to re-traumatize children. When children are disclosing about sexual abuse, for instance, it can be traumatizing to be asked in a harmful way, and they are usually full of shame and full of self-blaming. So it's very important that you ask questions which are not influencing those feelings. It's important to minimize the contaminating effect on the child's memory. We see the child's memory as a new fallen snow, as you can see on the picture. And when children are asked a lot of leading questions while they're waiting for the interview, that can contaminate their memory. And that's why it's very important that we get them as soon as possible, so we can have their mind fresh and their memory fresh. And this is also the way we can maintain integrity. We focus on those fundamental principles that we see the interview as a funnel approach, that you start with asking open-ended questions where they can have a free recall from the child, a disclosure from where we use recall memory. Usually we start with open-ended questions, but later on in the interview you might get into some pairing and think using some words the child already has been using. And the aim is to listen more and talk less. So in a good interview, you should talk, the child should talk around 75% of the time. But we have to think about the child's age. Children who are very young haven't the possibility to give us a full description of what happened from the beginning to the end. So this is a table or some guidelines you can have in mind, where you can see the age-appropriate questions for this forensic interview. For example, 4-year-old can tell you who did something to them, what happened, and maybe where it happened. But where you can see the light blue, only few of those children might tell you how it happened. So it's not until children are 11 years old they can give you the whole scenarios, where they can tell you from the beginning to the end what happened. And this is a very important information we give to our judges, so they can see what kind of questions in the end of the interview they can ask the child through the interviewer. The interviewer can learn this forensic interviewing technique, but it's very important that the interviewer has also the personality to be likable to children and to connect with children. That's very important. In Iceland, all our interviewers are educated in child's development, psychologists, and we are trained as a forensic interviewers. We can read children's behavior, because it's not only what they disclose about, but they show a lot of things, their feelings, through their behavior. especially young children. When they try to avoid some questions, when they start to crawl around in the room. And that's very important also to notice how are they showing with their behavior, how they are feeling, reading their body language. Some children who are very young, they don't have the verbal possibility to disclose. And then they use and show with their body what might have happened to them. And that's why it's so important to read this child's form of expression. We have knowledge in children's disabilities. We have children, and very often children, who are having some disabilities like autism, ADHD, and so on. And that's also important to know what you can expect from that child. It's also very common that the judges ask us, what does that mean that this child has this diagnosis and so on. When children are showing bad feelings in the interview, usually we stop or lower the pressure. We are pressing the child maybe to disclose about something which they think is very difficult. And then you can lower the pressure by asking them also important questions to talk about what is in the room. Can you tell me what you saw while this was happening? And then you take the child from their own feelings and you are talking about the surroundings, and that lowers the pressure and anxiety the child might feel. And then you come back and start to ask about the abuse. That can happen many times in the interview, but to lower the anxiety the child is feeling, you as an interviewer need to be in control and see when the child is feeling anxious. Because this interview should not harm the child, and using unsuitable questions can re-traumatize children. Because like I told you before, many children are full of shame when they come and disclose about the abuse. We focus on recall memory, and the recall memory trigger is triggered by non-direct open-ended questions, and that is very understandable for children because they disclose using their own words in their own way, both using hands and body and language to disclose. This gives us greater accuracy rate, and we are using questions like tell me everything about, tell me what happened next, and tell me more about this. This is also very easy questions for children to answer. Sometimes we focus on, in the end of the interview, on recognitional memory, and that is triggered by specific focused questions. It can be yes and no questions or multiple choice questions. Yes and no questions are very common in our culture. We ask children, was it fun in school today? Or did you enjoy the birthday party? Instead of saying, tell me about the birthday party, or tell me about your school today. So they are very common to those yes and no questions. That's why it's so important that we train them in using open-ended, answer open-ended questions. But recognitional memory is when we know, for example, that child had already disclosed about, for example, a red car, and they are not disclosing about that in the interview. We might say, did you see any car? That is an open-ended question, but it's more narrowed than the first open-ended questions. And that might help the child to recall what they already has told their mother, for example, or someone before the interview. So this should be delayed as long as possible because this can be risk of a leading question there. We have contamination risk there, especially with young children, because young children are very suggestible. then I'm talking about children under the age of 10, and they want to be polite and they want you as an interviewer to like them, so they might start to discuss something and fantasize about something. So delay that as long as possible. That is also a weak information that give us a more weak information. Suggestibility is something we need to have in mind, because that's if we are not focusing on the recall memory, recognitional memory. If we're focusing on that, that can be more risk of suggestibility. So it's very important that we focus on why children try to disclose about something that might not have happened. And the degree of which one's memory is recounting of event is influenced by suggested information or misinformation. And that can be because they have been told what to say, also been questioned in the way that it can be leading. But it's important to have in mind that children over the age of 10, they are not more suggestible than adults. So we have in Iceland 2 types of forensic interviews, and I'm not going to go deep into that. We have investigative interviews where we have monitoring the judge, the prosecutor, the police, child protection service, the child's legal advocate, the defense lawyer, and the alleged offender can participate if they want, but Barnahus is not a child offender-friendly place, so they are usually not here. And that's in cases where the case is reported to the police. We also have possibility to do some exploratory interviews for the Child Protection Service if the disclosure is very absent or weak, if the offender is not hasn't been identified, if the offender is below the age of criminal responsibility, and then it's only the Child Protection Service who are monitoring. But we use the same technique. The structure of the protocol is 2-stage. First stage, we do some rapport buildings. We do some introductions. We talk to the child. We tell them our name, and my name is Olav, and I'm talking to you here today. I work speaking to children. We talk about things they know themselves, about their schools, and we give them interview instructions. We practice narrative practice, and we talk about the family. In stage 2, then we go into the topic, the transition to the topic. We have some narrative descriptions there, follow-up questions, clarification, and closure. The interview structure is very important because the child needs to know the rules in the interview. We usually tell them that if I ask you the same question more than once, it's just I who have already forgotten that I've asked you. Because some children, if I ask the same question again, they think they didn't like the question, so they change their answer. So it's very important that they know it's my fault if I ask the same question again. If they don't know the answer, don't guess. If they don't understand me, they need to let me know so I can change my words or change the question. And also it is very important that they should correct me if I'm saying something they didn't say. Because in the interview, when I have mapped the interview, I need to go back into something they already have disclosed about. And then I usually repeat what they already have told me. And if I'm saying something wrongly or misunderstanding them, they need to know that they have the power to correct. And then we talk about the difference between truth and a lie. And then we test it. Usually we test all those instructions because we need to know if they understand it. So we play a little bit about the truth or a lie, and they know that they can use all the words they would like to use, even though it's dirty words, only if it's the truth. Then we go into narrative practice because that's important to practice this because we are, like in our culture, used to answer yes and no questions. So this is opportunity for me as an interviewer to observe the linguistic functioning and how the child is able to speak in a free narrative. They learn which questionings formats elicit the most narrative responses, and we observe if the child is reluctant or not. Then we have some transition to the topics, and then, as I told you before, the funnel approach, we need to have that in mind. Usually, after we have been talking and having this introduction and making this engagement with the child, then we usually go, okay, tell me why you're here today talking to me. And that is the most open-ended question you can ask. It's not leading in any way, and the child, you can give them free way or space to talk about why they're here. If they don't know, then you can narrow it down and tell. Often children come here today or to me and tell me that something happened to them. Has anything happened to you? And usually children recognize, okay, that's why I'm here today. And then they start to tell. And you can narrow it more down and go to more focused prompts, like you can see on this slide. Is someone worried about you? Are you worried about something? And so on. Then when you go and to the stage 2 and have this narrative description, then you continue to talk about an open-ended question all the time. Tell me more about X you told me before. Tell me all about this. Tell me what happened from the beginning to the end. And you need to say it in a neutral and polite way, but not ask them, can you tell me? And that is some, how can I say, it's something, the pit you fall into very often, can you tell me? Because usually children say, no, I don't want to. You need to be polite, but tell me more about. And then you can ask for explanation or further description, but it's very important that you don't rush while you are speaking to children. Yes and no questions can be leading. Was your mom at home when the abuse occurred? That can be leading. You can also ask, was anyone at home while the abuse occurred or while these things happened to you? Because yes and no questions it will be like a dialogue. You ask question and then you get answer, and then it's your mind that is limited to what you think might happen, instead of using open-ended questions. And you can also use open-ended question like, did anything else happen to you? Because usually get more information through asking those types of questions. Too many yes and no questions can discredit an interview, and it may be difficult to know if the child understands your questions, because telling yes and no is that something they are very common to, so they can easily say yes and no in wrong places. Also, when children are getting tired, they prefer maybe to say no because they are tired and they want to get out of the interview as soon as possible. Sometimes we are dealing with multiple events, and then it's very important as an interviewer that you are doing some mappings in your mind. When children abused several cases or several occasions, it's very important that they need actually to describe every occasion. But if it's happening all the time, the same things happens, it's very difficult for them to disclose about each event. Then it's you as an interviewer, you need to find something that makes each event different. For example, if I give you an example, if I'm asking you about the Christmas 2015, you might not remember exactly because mostly Christmas is similar from year to year. But if I ask you, you had the red dress on the Christmas, tell me all about the Christmas 2015 while you were wearing the red dress. Then you're focusing on the recall memory, and then you can disclose and start with open-ended questions. Follow-up and clarification is very important because questions elicit further details. Keep your questions as open as possible through the whole interview. And you can use questions which are seeking for more clarification of something the child has already told about. For example, earlier you said that your dad friends kissed you. Explain friends kiss. For example, some children in Iceland, for example, they usually say that someone raped them. And then it's very important because sometimes they use rape for sexual abuse, which can be touching, for example. Then it's very important that you ask them, what is rape for you? And then you're also not talking about their own experience, you're talking about a word. And while they're explaining the meaning of the word for them, for example, rape, they disclose about what is rape for them, and then you can follow up with asking them, is anything like that happened to you? And tell me everything about that. In the end of the interview, you are summing up and using the child's words to see and be clear that you have understood the child right. And then you can return to everyday conversation because usually you want to end the interview by talking about some neutral topics. But before you do that, it's important that you ask the child, is anything else that I didn't ask about that happened to you? Is anything that you think is important that I know that you haven't told me about? And then if the child doesn't have anything, you answer usually if they have any questions, for example, and then you thank the child for the participation, time, and effort, not about the disclosure. Some reflections. Research shows us using this technique, this forensic interviewing technique, show us that children who are 4 and 5-year-old give us 2 times more information by using tell me more about, tell me everything about, tell me what happened to you instead of using yes and no questions. If you have 8 and 9-year-old children, they give you equally as much information as younger children if they're asked yes and no questions, but they give you 4 times more information if you are using tell me more questions. So, poll 3. Do you think it is important for children to be interviewed in a child-friendly environment? I would be very glad if you could give me some feedback on that. Because even though we know that child-friendly environment where you can lower the child anxiety, they feel safe and they feel that they are listened to, it's very important we can have different discussions about that and different things in mind. Here's also if you could give us some answer, why you think it's important that children are interviewed in a child-friendly environment. I would be also happy if you could give me some information about your thoughts. That's very important that the child feels relaxed, because we know when we are in a very stressful situation, which is when they are disclosing about the abuse, it's very important when you feel that you are as relaxed as possible, you have more access to the memory. We also know that when we are in stressful situation, we always remember a lot of things afterwards when we have relaxed and are not in the stressful situations. So thank you very much for your comment. Okay, and then we continue. Other reflections I would like to add to this presentation is this protocol always aims for the truth. We are interviewing children in truth-seeking to know what really happened to them. Of course, some children are giving some fake testimonies, but why? We need to know why are children giving some fake testimonies. I think this protocol is very helpful to avoid fake testimonies or false testimonies, because, for example, if I can give you an example here, I was interviewing two children, siblings. It was a custody battle, and they were interviewed because the father was supposed to have beaten them. And the 8-year-old could give me quite good overview of what happened, but couldn't go deep into its occasion. And it was just on the surrounding. It was couldn't go deep into sensations. And then the boy who was 5, when I asked him about, tell me why you're here today, and I asked an open-ended question, he said, I can't recall if my mom said my father was throwing me on the bed or on the floor. That gives us information about that the child was told what to tell. Children are having difficulties in disclosing about sensations and feelings and their experience if they haven't experienced that. So that's why when you're using the protocol and narrowing your questions down, like the funnel approach, like I told you before, you are getting deeper and deeper into very, how can I say, much sensations. When they are describing about feelings, they are sensations like smell, because that's very common. We ask about, did you hear anything? Did you feel anything? Did you smell anything? Because that also gives us more reliable information. And we can also discuss about why are children giving fake testimonies. Some teenagers are maybe trying to tell you something. They have been raped by a stranger. But maybe they have been abused sexually by someone who are close to them. And that's why they give some false negatives. They tell you something that didn't happen or deny that anything has happened to them. So we need to know why are children not disclosing about or giving false testimonies. We also know that false allegations can also be because the child has untreated PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, which can be a result of they have been abused by some close relatives or a friend, but they don't want to tell it, but they really need help or therapy. So we need to know and seek the truth. Why are children giving false or fake testimonies? So this is something we can discuss. Are children more likely to disclose or give false testimony in a child-friendly settings than in other settings? But I don't think so. When children are giving us here fake testimonies, I think the protocol very often helps us to find that out. So that's all for me, and I hope we get some questions here in the end. I would be happy to answer.
Yeah, there was one question actually.
If you have any.
Speak a bit about the differences between the NICHD and the NCAC approaches. Yeah.
Protocol? Yeah. It's not a lot of differences. NICHD protocol goes more deeper and is very helpful for you to when you are just going through the protocol. It gives you a lot of different kinds of questions. They aim for the same. They're both using open-ended questions. They are both focusing on free narrative and the same disclosure from the child. The NCAC is trained in the National Child Advocacy Centers. But Michael Lamb is one of the authors. I think it's of the both, but they are focusing on the same things.
And
open-ended questions, truth-seeking protocols.
Maybe you could discuss a little bit the difference of the impact on the interview for different kinds of violence, for example, like the or the way that the evidence from an interview is important in different ways for different types of violence.
Yeah, usually if we are interviewing children who have been physically abused, that's always happening within the family. And what I have found through all those years I've been interviewing children, it's very difficult for children to disclose about the physical abuse because it's one of the parents who have been abusing them. Also, physical abuse is totally different in a way because usually children feel that they have done something wrong. And while they are disclosing about physical abuse, they are telling that something is wrong with them. So that's why it's more difficult. And also what is difficult in those cases is that usually the child is living with one of the parent, and the one parent who is they are living with can impact their presentation or their disclosure. Sexual abuse cases are totally different because usually we are dealing with children who have been abused outside the family or in the surrounding of or circle of trust. 85% of cases are in the circle of trust, but not very common that it's happened within the nearest family. And sometimes if they disclose about sexual abuse cases where they have been happening within the home, then usually when they tell and when they disclose about the abuse, there is some divorce and so it's more likely that they feel safe. It's sometimes easier to interview children who have been sexually abused than children who are living in the household where you are dealing with physical violence and domestic
Maria
violence.
would like to know what kinds of materials you're using.
Did I answer your question?
The most difficult cases with autistic, mentally disabled children.
Yeah, that is very important that before we interview the child, that we get all the information about the child. Usually, before we interview the child, we meet the parents to know what the children is able to disclose, language they are using, common language. We get all the paper with diagnostic papers to have in mind. We also would probably meet their, I don't know what's the English word, there's some specialist who knows the child, and usually we meet that specialist and we talk about the child possibility to disclose. Once I was interviewing a boy with autistic boy with Downs and also ADHD. I got 300 words, which he was using like a dictionary, so I could use that in the interview. And that is something I need to be very, very well prepared. Also, what was very important information in that case is that when he doesn't understand, he usually nick his head and say yes. And that's why he wants me to continue. This was very important information, for example, I got from the parents, because then I knew I needed to describe further. We are also very, how can I say, experienced in talking to children who are 3.5, 4 years old. So we try to go down to the level and make questions very easy for those children in their possible way to understand. And while you're using open-ended questions, you are focusing on the child words and how they present and how they disclose what happened, and then you use same words and you try to get as much information from them as possible. Then you can also use drawings. You can ask them to show what happened to them, and so on and so on. It depends on the child, so to speak.
To my mind, you have a very difficult job, very mentally taxing job. What kind of support do you give? Do your colleagues give you? Do you engage in together? To what systems do you have in place to protect your own mental health and keep you doing the important work that the children in your area need you to be doing?
Yeah, thank you. This is a question I always get because, of course, it's very difficult to hear stories every day, but somehow, even though I will always have my feelings, I get quite used to it. But when we started 2015 to talk or interview children with physical abuse, then it touched me again. So then I didn't have these barriers or how can I say, barriers. So it touched me. But then what is very important is that every other week, we get some counseling from a doctor in psychology who comes here and talk to us about cases and our experience. We have also, if we are not coping with those cases, we have private counseling also. But the best thing I think, and I should recommend, is that direct after interview, if you're having difficulties coping with this child story, is talking to your colleagues. And usually that's what we do all the time. We talk about cases and usually we reflect on them. Then it's very important also is that we are also therapists. And because we are therapists, we know that when children are disclosing, this is the end of the abuse. And we know how children can continue and get well, and if they're coping with what happened to them and getting relevant therapy or therapy which is trauma focused, we know that they will get better and feel good and have a good life. So that's also good to have in mind. So I'm glad I'm not only a forensic interviewer, I'm also a therapist, so I can see the progress.
Thank you so much for that reassuring information, and also for this really brilliant intervention and presentation today. And I'm so glad that we're recording these so that our colleagues can watch them as they need to. And I think one of my favorite things about this whole webinar series is I get to see my brilliant colleagues like you. I don't get to see you enough. So thank you so much for joining us today. And before we end, I want to
thank you for having me.
That we haven't announced the next webinars yet, but if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get updated about that. We also have some exciting news about the future of Promise coming soon. So that's another reason to subscribe to the newsletter, so you get more information about that. And that is all from me. I hand it over to Katerina for final words.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shona, and thank you, Olaf, because the presentation was very interesting. It is amazing to hear all the examples. Those are very practical, and I imagine it's very useful for everybody doing this work on a daily basis. So once again, really pleasure to have you today. Thank you very much, and many thanks to all of you who participated today. I hope it was useful. We will have a quick poll to ask you about this webinar, but while we don't have announcements on the next Barnahus webinar, maybe I can use a chance to tell you that we have scheduled 2 webinars, which are Childhub webinars, and despite you may be interested in Barnahus very much, the topic still can be relevant for you. One is on burnout, and this is usually a topic which concerns everybody. So if you go on the Childhub webinar page, you will see that the burnout webinar will take place on March 20th, so it's next week. We will start a bit later in the afternoon, around 4 p.m. Central European time, because we are partnering with another organization based in US, and because of their time difference, we wanted to accommodate both sides of people who may be interested to join. We really hope you will join for this webinar, because it's never enough to talk about this topic and how we can address it. And the second webinar we will have is the last webinar in our Inspire webinar series, which Childhub is running starting from January. It will be about an anti-bullying program, so please feel free to check it on our webinar page and join us. The last remark from my side before I wish you a very nice afternoon is that if you're interested, you can get a certificate of attendance for this webinar. All you have to do is write us on the email that I just left in the chat. Thank you all for your replies in the poll. Many thanks to Shona and to Olaf, and looking forward to see you next week on Wednesday and Thursday for the 2 additional Childhub webinars. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.